If you can't come to the archives, then let the archives come to you. Unfortunately, lockdown has meant that we are currently unable to welcome readers to our home in Clerkenwell. Whilst the building itself might be closed to the public, we are now able to bring you access to our digitised online resources. Previously, you could only access these if you were either sitting in the public rooms at London Metropolitan Archives or if you had your own Ancestry account. The page that you are looking at is a recreation of our homepage on Ancestry, where you can find all of the digitised records that will be available to you during the course of Family History Fortnight. Before the mid-2000s, the only way to access all of the wonderful genealogical resources held at London Metropolitan Archives was to visit in person. You would then potentially have had to spend many hours trawling through the records, either on microfilm or possibly in original format, in the hope of finding the one piece of information that you were looking for. Fortunately, things are a lot easier today. This is thanks to an agreement that we signed with ancestry.co.uk to digitise many of our most popular records. Since then, those who have visited and those with their own Ancestry accounts have enjoyed the ability to search many of our resources quickly and easily, often by just entering the name of their ancestor into the relevant search box and clicking a button. During Family History Fortnight, London Metropolitan Archives and Ancestry are giving you free access to these datasets. So if you do have some spare time, why not make the most of this opportunity to further your family history research? Over the course of the next few slides, we will look at some of the different datasets available to you and discuss what you can expect to find, as well as providing a few tips to help you along the way. One of the earliest sets of records that Ancestry digitised was our collection of Anglican parish registers. That's not really surprising, given the fact that alongside census records and official certificates of births, marriages and deaths, parish records are probably the most important resource available to genealogists. London Metropolitan Archives holds registers of baptisms, marriages and burials for the vast majority of Anglican parishes in the London area, with some of our earliest registers dating back to 1538. Ancestry have organised our parish collection into 4 separate datasets. The first of these covers baptisms, marriages and burials between 1538 and 1812. From this search page, you can simply type in the name and date and click search. One of the key things to remember when searching is not to fill in all of the boxes. Sometimes less is more. The name of the individual and the name of their father might well be enough to find them. If you aren't finding the results that you're expecting, then you might want to investigate the browse facility to check that the parish you are interested in is actually covered by these digitised records. Remember, if you have any questions, you can always send us an email. Even though staff are now working at home, we are still operating a basic email inquiry service. The address to contact will be on the screen at the end of the presentation. At the start of the 18th century, records will most likely be found in a composite register format. This means that all 3 events, baptisms, marriages and burials, are recorded in the same register. This doesn't change until 1754, when marriages started to be recorded in their own separate volumes. Although this collection covers 1538 to 1812, most marriages after 1754 will be found in their own separate dataset. However, baptisms and burials up to 1812 will still be found here. Composite registers can be difficult to follow. Sometimes you will get more than one event on the same page. Alternatively, you might get a run of baptisms, and then it switches to burials, and then it switches again to marriages. There's also the possibility that one event will start at the front of the register and work its way forward, and another event will start at the back of the register and work backwards until they meet somewhere in the middle. This is an example of a composite register that is nicely laid out, and it's fairly easy to follow. In terms of the amount of information recorded, it's going to be fairly limited, and this will often be in the form of a single line entry. This register is from a slightly earlier period, and although a little trickier to navigate, it does include slightly more information. In reality, it was very much up to the individual compiling the register as to what information was recorded. For many vicars, it would be the bare minimum, but if you were lucky enough, you might get a bit more than just a name and a date. Things really start to change in 1754, following Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act. Whilst the Act itself was an attempt to better define the requirement for what constituted a legal marriage, and also to end the notorious clandestine marriages that took place in locations such as the Fleet Prison, it also had consequences for us as family historians. Marriages post-1754 are much more standardised. They're now recorded in their own separate registers, and therefore they require a separate data set. Although all the churches should have adopted this new format, some took a little longer than others to get the message, and continued to use the old composite registers. It is therefore always worth checking both this data set and the 1538 to 1812 one, especially if the marriage you are looking for is just around the time of the changeover. From 1754 to mid-1837, marriages should now be found in their own registers and usually on pre-printed pages, which makes them a lot easier to decipher. There would also be a set amount of information now recorded. This was as follows: the names of the bride and groom, their condition as to marriage and the parishes that they were from, the date of the marriage, whether this was done by banns or licence, the name of the vicar conducting the ceremony, the signatures or marks of the bride and groom, and the signatures of at least 2 witnesses. In July 1837, everything changes again with the start of official registrations of births, marriages and deaths. This is reflected by the move to the modern style marriage certificates that we are familiar with today. From this point onwards, we now get really useful extra pieces of information. These include actual ages of the bride and groom, although initially adult ages were simply recorded as being of full age if they were over 21. We also get occupations and addresses of the happy couple, but possibly the most useful addition is the name and occupation of the father of each party. This information helps greatly when trying to track somebody down using the census. The certificate should also show if the father had already died by this point in time. If this was the case, you would expect to see the word deceased written in brackets, as we do with the father of the groom in the bottom marriage on this page. The third of the parish data sets is baptisms from 1813 onwards. Unlike marriages, it took a little longer for baptisms and burials to get their own separate registers, but all that changed in 1813. At this point, a new pre-printed volume was introduced, and as with marriages, entries became standardised. In terms of the information that was recorded, you will now get the date of the baptism, the name of the child, and the name of the parents, although unlike birth certificates, mothers' maiden names are not given if the parents are a married couple. In the case of baptisms of illegitimate children, generally only the name of the mother will be recorded. The abode is also shown. Often this might just start out as an area within the parish, eventually becoming the name of a street, and then finally a full address. The profession of the father will also be listed. The main difference to birth certificates is that the date of birth is not always given. With baptism registers, there wasn't actually a column for the date of birth, although as you can see from this example at St James Paddington, some clergymen added this information by creating their own column. As time went on, it became more common to see the date of birth added in this way, but in the early days, it's more likely that you will only see the date of birth when the baptism that was taking place was for that of an older individual. Burials get their own data set from 1813 onwards, when like baptisms they started to use pre-printed registers. Previously, burial information may well have been limited to just a name and a date, but now, just as with other types of records, we are getting a standardised set of information. The information shown within the burial register will be the name of the individual, their abode, the date of the burial, their age, and the signature of the person who performed the ceremony. As you will see, we do not get an actual date of death or a cause of death. The important thing to remember with this particular dataset is that whilst you might get burial records for suburban parishes all the way through to the mid-20th century, for the inner London area it is a very different story. Burials stopped taking place in inner London burial grounds during the mid-1850s. This was because they were overcrowded and pretty unpleasant places, so the government intervened. From this point onwards, we see burials being transferred to purpose-built cemeteries out in the suburbs. London Metropolitan Archives holds little in the way of cemetery records. There are some bishops' transcripts for a few of the cemeteries in the London area that are included amongst this dataset, but only for a short period of time towards the end of the 19th century. Beyond this, we only hold registers from a couple of cemeteries. One of these is City of London and Tower Hamlets Cemetery. Fortunately, these records have also been digitised and have their own dataset, which is also searchable on Ancestry. Our partnership with Ancestry doesn't end with just parish records. We've also digitised a great many more of our most useful genealogical resources, including the following: electoral registers, poll books, land tax records and trade directories can be wonderful sources for finding where your ancestors were living and working. Why not investigate the school admission and discharge records to see if you can find where your ancestors were educated? Maybe your ancestors needed a little help at some point in their life. While this might not be a pleasant thought, the series of workhouse and infirmary registers, as well as the other poor law records like settlement examinations and lunacy records, can be invaluable sources for filling in some of the stories about your relatives' lives beyond the standard dates of births, marriages and deaths, and appearances in the census. We also have admission papers for those who received the freedom of the City of London. Unlike today, when we usually only hear about individuals receiving the honorary freedom, as in the case of Colonel Tom Moore and his fantastic feats of raising money for the NHS, in the past you had to obtain the freedom in order to be able to work within the walls of the ancient city. If you had ancestors in the city in the 18th century or earlier, these can be a really useful resource. Other datasets available include original wills and probate records from the Diocese of London and parts of the Diocese of Winchester prior to 1858. In the final few slides, we will take a look at what to expect from a few of the sources we have just mentioned. Workhouse and poor law records have been split into a number of different datasets, which can sometimes seem a little confusing. For example, workhouse births and deaths will actually be found in amongst the main series of parish baptisms and burials. One of the most useful datasets, though, is workhouse admission and discharge registers. The workhouse was basically the front door to receiving any kind of relief or welfare. You had to be admitted into the workhouse before you could be sent on to the infirmary or into the school system, and similarly, when you left these places, you would be sent back via the workhouse. With the advent of local boards of guardians taking over from individual parishes, it is often possible to follow these movements through the records. This example comes from the Bermondsey Board of Guardians and shows two individuals in my own family tree. The two in question are the brothers Robert Phipps, aged 6, and his younger brother Joseph, aged 2. Here we can see their return to the workhouse, having been discharged from the Peckham Children's Homes, where they'd spent the Christmas period following the death of their mother. Here you can see they are being discharged to stay with their grandmother. If you look at the dates of admission and discharge, they are both the same. They had been returned from the children's home to the workhouse just for the purpose of being collected by their grandmother, but each entry into the workhouse, no matter how short a period of time this was for, was always recorded, which is great for us family historians. When you dig a little further using the Poor Law and Boards of Guardians datasets, you can also find their first entry into the workhouse and their records from the period of time they spent at the children's home. Electoral registers are a really useful source for finding out where our ancestors are living, and often we can track exactly how long they were at one particular address and then see where they moved to. There are a few things that we need to consider. Most importantly is how limited the franchise was before the 20th century. Prior to 1918, there were a number of requirements that you had to meet in order to be able to vote, mostly in relation to property ownership, so this greatly limited the number of people that could vote. It was not until 1918 that most males aged 21 and over were allowed to vote. In the same year, the franchise was extended to some women over the age of 30, but it was not until 1928 that we see universal suffrage for women aged 21 and over. This is not to say that you won't find some women before this period, as the registers also included those that could vote at local elections, where the restrictions weren't quite as harsh. This example shows my great-great-grandmother, Honoria Driscoll, who is listed amongst the county and parochial electors in Rotherhithe as early as 1903. For a full guide to our electoral registers and who was able to vote at what date, why not have a look at our information leaflet on the subject, which you can find on our website. The final dataset we're going to look at is the one covering school admission and discharge registers. Unfortunately, when it comes to school records, the coverage is much less than you might first expect. This is down to the fact that schools only had to keep their records for about 8 years after a pupil had left. After that time, they were free to throw them away. Schools in the London County Council area did have the option to send their completed registers back to County Hall, and it is only those that chose to do so that you will find in our collection. Consequently, this dataset only covers the old London County Council area, what we class today as inner London boroughs. As you can see from this example, the registers only give a limited amount of information. They include the full name of the child, the Christian name of the child's father, and the address of the family, the date the child started school, and the child's own date of birth. As you can see though, many of the columns were never filled in, and quite often the date of leaving is also missing. It was, however, usually filled in when a child transferred schools earlier than anticipated, and occasionally you might even get a comment that tells you the name of their next school. So there you have it. Hopefully that will prove a useful introduction to some of our main family history resources. All of these will be available to you, free of charge, from the 18th of May up to and including the 31st of May. So try and make the most of these amazing records while you can. Also, please feel free to contact us with any questions that you may have about any of our records. Although we are operating on limited resources away from the archives, we are still running a basic inquiries service, and we are happy to help if we can.